Our second lecture this week is going to pay specific attention to culture. And so, culture is really the aspect of our social lives that gives meaning to us. So, we'll ask the question, how does the concept of culture help explain the differences and similarities that we see in people's way of life? We have to start by defining what culture is. And if you'll remember from lecture one, I did make the comment that some definitions of culture basically define culture as anything that is not culture, which of course isn't really an effective way to define a term. So, working with E.B. Tyler's definition, culture is the complex whole which includes belief, knowledge, art, law, morals, custom, and any other capabilities acquired by man as a member of society. And of course, the man here means human, right? In the 1800s, uh, we weren't about, let's say, genderless kind of terms for humanity. There are some particular features of culture that are very important. One of those is that culture is learned. So when we talk about what comes from our evolutionary history of human evolution from non-human primates and such, um, all people have an innate capacity for culture. This is something we all share. This is what the evolved trait is the ability to possess culture, but the culture that we express is dependent upon the culture that we learn. So there was a period 20, 30 years ago where there were a lot of adoptions of infant girls from China. China has since closed their doors to foreign adoptions, and they've worked really hard to place these females in families in China by providing some monetary incentive for Chinese families to adopt Chinese orphans. But when these infant girls were adopted by foreign entities, they didn't come automatically speaking Mandarin. They didn't grow up really automatically having a preference for stir fry and rice or lo mein or something of that sort, right? The languages that foreign adoptees learn to speak are based on the languages that they hear. So, girls adopted from China 20, 30 years ago grew up speaking English and grew up with McDonald's and things like that. So the actual specifics about the cultural features that we express are dependent upon learning. Culture uses symbols. Language itself is symbolic. There's nothing inherent in the letter A that makes it go ah as a sound, right? All of this, all of our alphabet, our reading, our writing, our speaking, are based on learned symbols. So even some of the behaviors that we express, think about like liturgical sequences. In church, right? My kids grew up going to Catholic school, so there are learned responses where the priest will say something and the congregation will respond back with a scripted kind of specific statement, right? That's all symbolic. Um, so there is a lot about what we do, not just language wise, that rests in the use of symbols. Culture is dynamic, always adapting and changing. Think about fashion trends, for example, right? I can't believe that mom jeans came back in style when that really was like what all 80s jeans are like, high waisted, um, pleats in the front of pants, etc., right? So there are aspects of culture that stay consistent, but there are specifics of culture that change with the times. We've innovated new vocabulary, for example, that deals with technology, right? From the 1950s on, we've been forced to, as technology has become an increasingly important part of our lives. Prior to the 1950s, we didn't need all of this language dealing with computers and networks and the internet and such. So we are ready to adapt to the changing technology, changing culture, right? And that necessitates changes in other expressions of culture. So, for example, changes in technology forcing changes in language. Culture is integrated with our daily experience. We're going to talk about this in more specific terms, but our culture and the culture that we've been that we've grown accustomed to, that we've learned, that we share, um, is a part of our daily life. So when you think about um, American culture, for example, when you think about some of the values and kind of core beliefs that Americans possess, one of those is this notion of freedom, of democracy, right? So, how does that get integrated into our daily lives? Well, we experience a lot of resentment if we're in, for example, a workplace that doesn't function as a democracy, right? That our say doesn't really matter. When we go shopping, we expect to have freedom of choice as to which stores we go to and which items we buy, right? So these aspects, these core beliefs are integrated into our economics, are integrated into our workforce, are integrated into our interactions at home. Culture shapes everybody's life. It's not there aren't really people who are able to be like the mythical raised by wolves, right? With, to be a healthy, functioning member of human society, you've got to recognize and kind of conform to aspects of culture, and we can see this really well in um, some of these tragic cases where people have been raised isolated from other humans, and that they grow up not really being full, functional, able to hold healthy social relationships individuals. Right? They're lacking language. They're lacking social cues. A lot of this is very important to experience early in life. And so it's critical that children specifically grow up with um, being exposed to features of their culture for them to be able to adequately learn and express those cultural features. Culture is shared. It's not something that an individual possesses, rather, it's something that a group possesses. So I don't know if you guys ever did when you were little, but when I was little, we had a clubhouse and we developed our secret language, the language that only we knew how to speak, which ironically was based in Pig Latin, which again, everybody knows at some point in their childhood how to speak Pig Latin. But, this secret language, developing a system of communication, means absolutely nothing if there's no one to share it with. So it doesn't do any good if you solely possess it as an individual. If someone else doesn't understand you, then that language doesn't really function. And then culture or cultural understanding involves overcoming ethnocentrism, right? Ethnocentrism is inherent for humans. And this is something that we have to battle every day to move beyond, right? We have this innate tendency to view the world in light of our own culture and to really be able to understand and appreciate other people's cultural traditions. We have to overcome that bias. We have to kind of put that to the side and really focus on appreciating their culture for everything that it contributes, and um, every aspect of it as good in its own right, as valid in its own right. All right, so we'll talk about each of these in turn. Culture is learned. This process of learning cultural rules and logic of a society begins at birth. This is known as enculturation. So let's think of some of the things that babies are enculturated towards, right? Um, First of all, there is explicit instruction, right? When a baby starts babbling, especially when the first phonemes or sounds that babies produce are and da, right? Well, what do we do as parents when babies start saying mama, 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 right? We go, that's right, mama. I'm mama. Good job, right? That's explicit instruction. Same for dada. So people will be like so proud. Look, my baby's only 6 months old and already is saying mama. Well, at 6 months, they don't really have the understanding of language, right? They're not saying it with intent and and really actively communicating the idea of mama, but we're so excited by it, right? So we kind of co-opt the early sounds that babies make to make ourselves feel better. But this language instruction that we do with babies and young children is explicit. I mean, think about schooling, right? Why do we send kids to compulsory public school? Well, it's to educate them, it's to enculturate them. So, what are some of those school ready skills that kids need? Um, it's more than just knowing letters and letter sounds and abstract concepts like numbers, right? It's things like waiting your turn, sharing, standing in line, being quiet until it's your turn to speak, all those sorts of things. So, a lot of education is built on this explicit instruction. But culture can also be learned implicitly, right? So there are things that we can do to kind of reinforce social norms without it being as, let's say, explicit, right? So think about the kid who comes out wearing their underwear on their head, right? We laugh about it, then we take it off and we put the underwear on their legs, right? There are a lot of things that we do that reinforce those cultural norms, those rules that the kids need to follow without sitting there and giving them a lecture on how to put on clothing. So think about reading. How old were you when you were enculturated to read? How long has this process of learning how to read really been a part of your life, right? For kids to really successfully be able to learn how to read, they need to be exposed to books when they're young. A lot of the skills of reading and engaging in kind of storytelling and uh, understanding sequence of events and such, a lot of that comes with being read to as a young child. So how early, if you've got kids at home, how early did you expose them to books, right? There is a deficit that kids of lower socioeconomic status experience. And there's been a push to bring books into families that are at lower socioeconomic status, that are living in poverty. And so there's a movement right now, a public health movement called a Million Word Movement, where by bringing books and really stressing the importance of reading to young children, they're trying to equalize things because by the time kids enter kindergarten, those who come from upper socioeconomic strata have heard a million more words than those that are in lower socioeconomic strata. And think about the way that families of different economic standing interact with their kids, right? Wealthy families will often sit there and have conversations. What did you learn in school today? What do you think about the governor's response to the coronavirus quarantine, et cetera, right? We discuss big topics, we ask their feelings and such. Whereas children that grow up in lower socioeconomic strata families, the language that they get is often instructions. It's like, shut up, right? Sit down, mom's tired, leave me alone, be quiet, that kind of stuff. So the way that language is being used integrally, golly, I can't even speak today. The way that language is intentionally being used in those households is very, very different. And so what that results in is is inequity in skills and learned culture by the time kids enter uh, kindergarten. And so those lower socioeconomic status kids are already like a full year behind. And that only becomes magnified with compulsory, with public schooling, right? By the time these kids reach middle school, the higher socioeconomic strata kids are way ahead. By the time they graduate high school, if they graduate high school, right? The higher socioeconomic status kids are already accepted into college with scholarships and such, where the lower socioeconomic status families might not have even graduated from high school. So, a lot of economic discrimination and prejudice that is built in just merely like jump started by this lack of access to language and being read to by children at really young ages. Can you think of any other examples? Right? How did you learn about your family's religious um, identity? Right? If you find yourself religious, I mean, chances are in New Mexico, there's a high probability that you might identify as a Catholic. right? And that comes from our cultural history of Catholicism and Hispanic influences. The conquistadors brought Catholicism with them, and that spread to the pueblos, and many Hispanic families value that identity of being Roman Catholic. So, how was that? How did you gain that knowledge, right? Some of that was direct instruction. You go to catechism class, you go to what's called CCD, or kind of continuing Catholic education, right? And some of that is just kind of implicit or expected, right? You go to mass, you learn how to sit quietly, you mimic your parents so that when they kneel, you kneel. When they stand, you stand. When they respond with scripted responses, like end with your spirit, right? You respond with and with your spirit. So you can think about any cultural kind of factor or behavior, and you can really reflect on that and see how you were essentially trained or enculturated into expressing that cultural feature. Culture uses symbols. Symbols may be verbal, they may also be nonverbal. Of course, after about 5,000, 6,000 years ago, we started writing down symbols. Alphabets are in, innately symbolic. These symbols provide a great deal of cultural stability. Symbols are also used to make something intangible tangible. So you think about religion, right? What is kind of the ultimate expression of at least Christian religious ideology? It's a cross, right? Whether that cross is a full crucifix or whether it's just a cross. When you see that, it incites feelings, generally positive feelings, right? You're introspective. You start thinking about the presence of a deity in your life and the calmness and kind of security that fosters. So something like religious belief is not tangible. You can't box it up and hold it, right? But through symbolism, it becomes very real to us. So the reason the red panda is pictured here is because, something like a wink. How do we distinguish the difference between a wink and a twitch? Red pandas, are kind of uh, broadly related to raccoons. Do you think red pandas have the intellectual capacity to wink conspiratorially at another individual? Well, probably not, right? So when they close one eye, it's probably a twitch. It's probably because something's in that eye. It's probably to fulfill some biological urge or function. Now, what about people, right? Just even that wink, wink, nudge, nudge, right? We use one closed eye as a symbol of conspiracy, of, hey, we're in on one side of this joke. We're in on one side of this joke. You're not, right? Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. So the recognition and subsequent analysis of the symbols around us gives rise to a theory of culture called Goetz's interpretive theory of culture. And so this kind of proposes that anthropologists as a discipline seek to understand the meanings behind the symbols in one's daily life. So, reflect on that for a minute. Think about which symbols are really important to you, which symbols are integral to your family, and kind of reflect on that. What kind of function are those symbols serving? Cultures are dynamic and always adapting and changing. They're not static entities. So if we look here at the gears in this picture, we've got belief, economic, and social aspects, right? Well, what's true of gears? When they're not turning, they're static, they're unchanging. But when they are turning, a change in one prompts a change in another. And so here with these gears, if economic situations change, right, that's going to affect both kind of our social reality and also our core belief system. Cultures are comprised of a dynamic and interrelated set of social, economic, and belief structures. So you have to understand all three of those and how they interact with one another to understand how the whole of the culture operates. And so today's anthropologists really look at culture as a dynamic process, right? We each have culture in the sense that we have learned our cultural heritage, but we also each are uniquely poised to change culture, to influence the direction that culture is going to take, right? We are facing incredible economic um, really collapse and changes based on a global pandemic. So this is one of those times where, as individuals, we are going to have the ability to affect kind of the direction that culture takes. So, anthropologists pay close attention to the relations of power and inequality in their analyses of cultural processes, right? It's often those who are in power that are able to affect or direct cultural change, but that then changes the level of equity or inequity that's present in that culture. So, the decisions that a president makes, for example, have kind of lasting, potentially negative economic consequences on the people in their country, right? We've been seeing this in the United States. Absolutely. When we use a cross-cultural perspective, this demonstrates the incredible flexibility and plasticity of us as a species. Human belief and practices come in all shapes and forms. When we have big cultural change that might be driven by changes in an economic process, we can use the kind of before and after context for cross-cultural comparisons. So there will be a wealth of research done on America before the pandemic versus America after the pandemic, just as there have been analyses done on like the role or the effect that the Great Depression had on American culture. Culture is integrated with our daily experiences. The beliefs and values that we have are shaped by many integrated elements of our life, right? So, what's considered normal in some cultures is not in others, and it's constructed by the rules, either those spoken rules or unspoken rules that are governed by society. So, here we have a plate of fine dining that looks quite delicious until perhaps you notice that those are insect larvae as the protein source, right? Well, we as a culture in America generally don't want to eat insects, right? We find that disgusting. If there's a fly in your soup, isn't that like a typical? I don't know. There was it was almost a meme before memes were a thing, right? It was an old joke that a lot of comedians would use about, oh, waiter, there's a fly in my soup. And you'd have whole skits built around the fly, the mythical fly in the soup, right? So we tend to look upon insects in our food with revulsion. We think that's gross. We think that food's contaminated, it's dirty, etc. Right? When insect consumption really could solve the world's food insecurity. There are a lot of cultures where insects are eaten. I've personally eaten insects in a variety of contexts. Stir-fried crickets are pretty good. I've had candy bars where the crunch factor was by ants, not by rice cereal, like a Nestle Crunch bar, right? There are a lot of cultures where larvae is seen as having a good deal of fat and protein, um, and thus are a really important kind of component of a healthy diet. So, and then that insect consumption can be kind of rustic or even elevated to the level of fine dining that you see in this picture. So, what do you consider healthy, disgusting, or cool, right? In the 1960s, saturated fats were viewed as basically the root of all evil, right? The American Heart Association started a campaign where low fat became synonymous with good health, and we increased our reliance on vegetable oils that was driven a lot by the corn lobby, rather than eating things that were fried in lard or butter, right? Well, that has been coupled with a rise in heart disease. So, in essence, these vegetable oils really aren't all that healthy for us. And it's not really healthy to eat a low fat diet that replaces the flavor that would come from fat with other things like salt and sugar. The modern day ketogenic or paleo kind of diet movement, those are kind of in response to declining health. So we've seen a pendulum shift, right? Where now the idea is that these full fat and then lean animal products, right? That the full fat is better, that the animal fat is better, that we need to stay away from grains and carbohydrates. So, what's considered healthy? What's considered disgusting? What's considered cool? Culture shapes everybody's life. No one is kind of divorced from culture. We all have culture, whether we realize it or not. And what we consider cultural features are really broad and include things like pop culture references. So, there's some colleges now that are offering degrees in meme studies. Who would have thought 5, 10 years ago that memes would have been worthy of graduate level research, right? So we all have culture, yet, like accents, we tend to notice those that are different from what you're familiar with. And so in the US, that's coupled with our tendency to view minority populations, immigrants, et cetera, as different or people with culture. So that means that whites then don't have culture, right? Whites do have culture, but our culture is the mainstream, and any group that differs from those mainstream patterns becomes more visible to everybody. In this context, those who appear to have more quote unquote culture appear to have also have less power. So we need to we really need to shift this framework and way of thinking of the world. One way that whites have tried to reclaim, let's say, culture, is to recognize the cultures of their European heritage. So, my kids have culture, right? And of course, they have white American culture. We are white Americans, but my husband and his family were German immigrants, and his parents never became citizens. And he's got the bulk of his family still living in Germany and Switzerland. So that has offered a way to bring a cultural heritage that separates and individualizes my kids' experiences so that they consider themselves German Americans, right? So when they think about their cultural food, it's Spätzle and Wurst and such. When they think about cultural expressions, particularly around holidays, right? We celebrate Sankt Nikolastag, St. Nicholas Day, and they put their shoes out and they get filled with candy and such. We make the traditional German straw ornaments. We do a lot of the traditional German baking around the holidays. So, even whites can embrace cultural ideals. The problem is, um, when those mainstream normal patterns are viewed as let's say regular or normal, right? When those mainstream patterns are the dominant cultural ideal and we don't accept alternative expressions of it. So we've really, as white Americans, have a long way to go with respect to recognizing the oppression that this kind of acceptance of mainstream white middle class America, the damage that it does to people that have other identities, to people of different races, to people of different socioeconomic strata. And this is a way in which ethnocentrism rears its ugly head. That it's something that we have to actively prevent or actively reshift how we frame things. Culture is shared. For a thought or action to be cultural, it has to be shared. People make sense of their world and they order their lives by participating in social groups. The quarantine in the coronavirus case um, has really brought to light um, how important social relationships are, right? Because we've been unable to keep up with those social relationships because we're basically isolated in our homes and not able to interact with people. And there are absolutely negative consequences of this. We've seen an increase in things um, like depression, anxiety. We've seen a spike in suicide cases. We, as a species, are not meant to be completely separated or completely isolated from other people in our cultural group. We are a social species first and foremost, and we gain a lot health wise, mental health wise from those social relationships. Today, culture may be transmitted face to face or virtually using a variety of technological innovations. How many of you have had to do any Zoom meetings, for example, during the quarantine process, right? That's a way of giving us face to face contact without actually being face to face. It's a poor substitute, though. One of the things I've really been missing is hugs, right? Really, particularly like with my students, I know that, in the whole educational field, it's kind of like a weird thing. Should we hug our students or not? At our school, we've got a really great just concept of consent. And so that comes down to hugging too. And so, like, every day I'd have certain students who would come up and be like, Dr. Mueller, is it okay? I really need a hug. May I give you a hug? Right? I miss that. I mean, my kids give me hugs, but my kids have always given me hugs, and I worry for some of my students who came in daily for hugs. What they're getting at home, what they're lacking specifically. So, um, yeah, this socialness, this shared aspect of culture is critical. In sharing culture, people collectively build meanings through common experiences and negotiation. So culture is kind of a give and take. How do we decide what are going to be our core group values? Well, we negotiate that process. How are we going to decide what's going to be the dominant image associated with a particular cultural ideal? Well, again, we negotiate that. And so we actively construct culture. A construction derives from past collective experiences in a community and lots of people talking about it, thinking about it, acting in response to a common set of goals and problems. So when we think about the American notion of individualism, right? Haven't you heard that hard work pays off? Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. If you want something, all you have to do is work hard to get it. The American dream kind of thing, right? This has been an integral part of our society since we were colonies. I mean, the American Revolution, it was pull yourself up by your bootstraps. If we want it, we've got to take it. Let's work together, but as individuals, right, to wrest our freedom away. You don't like what mainstream Europe is doing, then come and assert yourself and be an individual in the newly formed United States. So it's no surprise that this still applies and that this also um, applies to our like international policy kind of um, behaviors as well, right? We really pride that individualism, the role that one person has. And as soon as we start to think about group level behaviors and group level needs, it harkens to socialism. And then we're all scared that these people are communists that are going to drive us to, be like China or be like what the Soviet Union used to be like or whatever, right? We tend to shy away from policies that question that individualism, that are more strongly associated with a group or collective goal. Our cultural understanding has to overcome ethnocentrism. To overcome ethnocentrism, as cultural anthropologists, we practice cultural relativism. That means that instead of viewing the culture in light of our own cultural ideals, we interpret another culture using their goals, their values, and their beliefs. This doesn't mean that we necessarily accept and defend all things that people do. So it is not synonymous with moral or ethical relativism. We don't, for example, condone murder, condone torture, condone infanticide, etc. Right? There are things that we argue violates a greater human level universal set of rights. But beyond that, when behaviors don't kind of violate the universal human rights, we accept behaviors at face value. We accept expressions of another cultural's behaviors and ideals as valid in their own right.